My name is Basil Sharp. I'm the Director of the Energy Centre in the Business School, and this is our first Energy Matters for 2019. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the support that we get from the Energy Education Trust of New Zealand, who help us run events like this. And we are planning to put a plug in for a future event, hopefully towards the end of the year. We want to have a look at net zero carbon bill that's going before the House at this particular point in time. So, but anyway, we'll get back in touch with you on that. A few housekeeping matters. Toilets go out here, turn left. If we have an emergency evacuation, come out through this door here, turn right, and just go straight out through the large doors on this loop. Okay? So, this is a collaborative effort between Z Energy and the Energy Centre, and I just am reminded of a contribution that Mike Bennett's made in an earlier Energy Matters series when oil was pushing $170 US a barrel. So it's really great to have Z Energy collaborating, working with us again. So thank you very much for the opportunity to bring Michael to this event. And now I'm going to turn it over to Julian to introduce Michael.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi mahane te pōne. Good evening, and it's a real pleasure and privilege really to be able to introduce Michael and to be here with you tonight. And just returning the acknowledgement, Basil, it's great to join with you in the Energy and your team to bring this here. And it was always sort of part of our vision when we thought about bringing Michael out for a few days. It's his first time in Aotearoa, so we wanted to learn from him, and we've had lots of really good conversations with him, with our board and executive and members of the team. But the vision always was to try and share him around and get the opportunity for people in the wider community with interest in what he's got to talk about to be able to hear from him. So to see such a diverse group here today to do that is really pleasing from our perspective. All I really wanted to say in introducing Michael in terms of setting a little bit of context from Z's point of view is why are we interested in this conversation? And I think, and Basil alluded to it in terms of Mike Bennett's, in terms of certainly how he set up Z Energy and his leadership, is that at the end of the day we're an energy company. We're interested in moving people around. And at the moment we do that by selling a lot of hydrocarbons. But we know that story is changing, and our challenge is to understand when that's happening and to make the strategic choices about what we want to do about that. And so having someone like Michael here is really, really useful for us, because it really challenges our thinking and gets us to start putting our money where our mouth is, such in terms of that vision for our company. So my name's Julian Hughes. I'm the General Manager of Strategy and Risk, and if that doesn't help you understand why it's important that I'm connected to Michael, then anything will. So in terms of our future, I think we've got two options. We just carry on as we are and kind of can see where that's going, or we start to be a part of a transition to a cleaner, greener energy future, and helping people move around. So Michael's a really hard person to introduce because he has a really, really long bio, and he's kind of one of those guys that you go, what have I going to be doing all my life? Because the bio is full, and it's really impressive, and it's probably one of the reasons you're here. But the things that I would say to help introduce you is he's most well known, and one of the reasons we were so interested in him for setting up New Energy Finance, which he sure we talked to, but he sold after he set it up to Bloomberg, so that became Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which we believe provides great insight into what's happening in terms of the energy future, and Michael still contributes to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. He sits on numerous advisory boards, too many to really mention, but one that's certainly really relevant for us, and I think some of the people we've been talking to, is he spent 6 years on Transport for London, so working as a board member advising in a large city, what are they doing about their transport needs. But the key point that I want to make, and why I think he's so interesting, is that he's a participant in this conversation as opposed to an observer. So you might get indication of that as he goes through, but he's an investor, he's an advisor, and he's playing in the space as opposed to someone sitting back from it. And what comes with that, which I think is hugely refreshing and something you never quite know when you bring people out to talk, but what I think is really refreshing is he's really, really happy to provide an opinion on something. So he doesn't sort of sit on the fence. And I think I sort of introduced him this morning and said sometimes that opinion hits you straight between the eyes, and that's, I think, a really good thing, and it sort of wakes you up. So that's a hugely valuable thing that I think he can bring, is not only provide us with some information, but actually challenge us and provoke us in terms of how we're thinking, because I believe that's what we're going to need if we want to change our energy future. So lastly, I'd say is, if that's not all enough, Michael skied in the 1992 Winter Olympics, so he's kind of covered those bases as well. So we took him to South Island the weekend, or Roger did, and we were worried he might turn up in one piece today, but he said, don't worry, I've got it covered. And there wasn't even enough snow to go skiing, I don't think, but he would have been all right had we put him on the slope. So without further ado, introduce you to Michiel Liebreich. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Julian. Thank you, Basil. There's always somebody out there that's thinking, wow, he skied in the Olympics. I wonder if he won. So I was on the British team, but I was the highest placed management consultant. So what I can do, I can always give opinions. Julian, you're very kind. You like being hit between the eyes with my opinions. My opinions are slightly more likely to be right than wrong, but they're certainly not infallible. And I've been in New Zealand all of under a week. It's been a wonderful week, and I'm really honoured to be here. But it's less than a week. Anything I say about New Zealand, take with a pinch of salt. But I do this quite a bit. I go around the world. I travel to different countries, and so hopefully, what I can do is give some trends and some data and some information about energy. I'll try and, I think, do a little bit more on transportation. And my understanding is this audience has been sort of sold the idea that I will have some thoughts or answers on transportation. But we will start with energy, and you'll see sort of why, because I think the convergence is very important. And hopefully, I can give some insight that might be of use. One of the things I'll take as a starting point, social media today. And there's all these news stories about how wonderful wind power is and solar power. The problem with social media is if you click on one of these stories, your entire timeline fills up with how the problem is solved. It's all easy. You click on one story about offshore wind being competitive with no subsidy, and suddenly all you get is this fantastic sort of stream of good news, fabulous stories about innovation, and you think, well, I don't understand what the problem is. And it's the same with electric vehicles. If you click on one story about how fabulous the Tesla 3 is, then that's all you see. And you see this steady stream of stories about innovation and this, that, and the other, and transformation, how quick it's going to go. And you get some crazy people saying, so we're all going to be doing self-driving electric cars, 95% of all trips and it's just, that's all you'll get in your timeline. And of course, there is a parallel universe. I don't know, I'm assuming, because you've all come here to listen to me and nobody's thrown a bread roll yet, you're probably all the sorts of people who do click on those stories. But then there'll be a part of you that will worry, because there's a parallel universe. There are people who are clicking on the story about, sort of these appalling things like the sun doesn't shine at night. And every so often there's no wind, and batteries don't get recycled; they get thrown on the garbage. And there's a whole sort of parallel universe of bad news, and also then, in all seriousness, very serious, very sensible people who say things like the great hope for a quick and sweeping transition to renewable energy is wishful thinking. And this isn't just anybody. This is a very eminent economist. It's Bill Gates' favorite economist. He writes a book every 15 minutes or so, very prolific, but also very, very smart. And he says energy transitions are slow. They tend to take 50 years. And all this stuff about wind and solar doing anything important in the world is actually wishful thinking. So where does the truth lie? And so that's something that perhaps I can try and help with. I've been using this paradigm the 3/3 world, where we're headed by 2040. And so I'll start by just trying to explain, this is kind of where we're going based on existing trends. This is just, so it's neither we're going to get all renewable, all problems solved, fully electric by whatever, nor is it this is all nonsense and nothing's happening. I'm going to try and persuade you that we're going to go to this 3/3 world by 2040. And then we can ask whether that's enough from a climate perspective. Is that fast enough? Because it's certainly, I'll tell you, the 3/3 world, 1/3 of electricity to be wind and solar, probably about half of all global electricity to be zero carbon, if you include nuclear and bioenergy, 1/3 of vehicles to be electric, and the economy 1/3 more energy productive, so 1/3 more output for every unit of energy. This is a pretty positive picture compared to when I started New Energy Finance back in 2004. I'd have, if you'd have offered me that, I'd have been like, bye, that's great. That's way better than we would have thought. But then we'll ask the question at the end, is that enough? And if it's not enough, what do we want to do about it? So the idea here is, where are we going? So then we know whether we have to sort of do a handbrake turn, accelerate a bit, whether we just coast to victory, whether we have to destroy capitalism. Hopefully we can sort of get some sense of that in the first part of my remarks. So let's talk electricity first. I started tracking the money flowing into clean energy, and the definition that I was using, renewable energy, energy efficiency, power storage, smart grid, carbon capture and storage, all the kind of good things. I didn't include the somewhat good things like nuclear and natural gas, although they're part of our future, globally, not nuclear in New Zealand, but globally for the next few and definitely few and probably many decades. And what you can see is that it sort of grew very quickly. I looked at this just recently and I thought, hang on a second, I know what was going on here. New Energy Finance, I founded in 2004 and I sold it in 2009. And if I'd have actually kept hold of it and not sold it, then frankly climate change would have been solved by now because it would have kept growing. But what it did was it stalled. The dollar value stalled at about $350 billion a year, going into into the clean end of clean technologies. I'm sure all of you are such experts here at the Energy Centre, you already know that there's about $2 trillion every year that goes into energy if you take upstream oil and gas, midstream, downstream, all the way down to the sort of forecourts, the coal mines, the investment in the grid, as well as the generating capacity, because grid investment is not in this figure. That's $2 trillion. So a rule of thumb, if you walk away with any sort of simple heuristics, we're at about $1 in every 6 that is being spent on this stuff. And it grew, pretty rapidly. And you can also see here something very interesting, the eras of history starting to build up. So the first era, the more you wanted, the more you spent. There is the installations in gigawatts. So for the first period, it pretty much tracks the money. So if you subsidized more, you got more, and if you didn't, then you didn't. But then it goes into this kind of second period where, although the investment has stalled, the gigawatts installation has not. And the reason for that is, of course, that the costs started to come down, and you can very clearly see there's a kind of cusp somewhere in the middle of that period there. So lying behind it is the experience curve. And I was just very fortunate in my career because very early on in the 1980s, I was calculating experience curves in my first job. And so that was one of the reasons why I started New Energy Finance. I could see all these problems in the energy sector, climate change, Gulf War, depletion, peak oil. There was this thing, it didn't happen. But I could also see that these other technologies, clean energy technologies, that would have rapid experience curves. And that was the foundational insight. I started the company, and that's kind of, in a way, why I'm here today. So you can see they continued, and very aggressive, very fast experience curves. 28% is pretty much the fastest you'll find outside software, right? And then 15% for wind. So for every doubling, these figures are for every doubling of cumulative capacity built, cumulative experience, you'll see these cost drops. And they'll never stop. The experience curve never rests. The experience might accumulate more slowly as things get big, but they will never stop working. And it's very, very different from resource economics. This is different from find some coal, open a mine, build some rail, and then your costs are pretty much done. Very difficult to reduce costs thereafter. This is material science, it's software, it's also cost of capital dropping as people became familiar with the technology. What does it look like? Over on the left, you can see what a solar farm looked like in 2005. That was a big solar farm. And then over on the right, you can see what they look like now. And obviously, this is not New Zealand. But that's big solar farms now. We're talking about the first gigawatt scale solar is being built. And actually, given that there's a lot of desert in the world, there's a lot of sun, these are going to get bigger and bigger. With wind, when I started, they were installing, the average turbine being installed was about 1.72 megawatts, but 4 megawatts were on the, were coming down the tracks. And we were all like, oh my God, 4 megawatts, 4 megawatts, that's just such a monster. And of course, what happened, shortly after, they start talking about 7 megawatts, that was another family of wind turbines, 9 megawatts, and we're about to see the first 12 megawatt, the first of the new GE big wind turbines, mainly offshore, because people kind of object to these things. I was told that my mother doesn't know what I do for a living. So I she's 88. She's very sharp. So I showed her some of these charts and said, look, I go around the world and I tell people that, these trends. And I showed her, and she said, wow. She said, 13 to 15 megawatts. That is unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. She said, but what I don't understand is, why would you build one in front of the Shard? So where that trend has taken us is now this. This is the world record. These are the Usain Bolt of the clean energy project world. And you've got solar PV, 2 US cents per kilowatt hour. To put it in perspective, even in the US, a new gas-fired power station, CCGT, would be probably 5 or 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is 1/3 of the cost. Wind, 1.77, and this is unsubsidized. This is the before you add the effect of any government support. And then offshore wind, quite extraordinarily, 5 US cents. Right? That is, and all of these surprised everybody, even me and my team. Offshore wind just a few years ago was 12 cents, and now suddenly it's 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And that project there in Mexico, that 1.77 cents per kilowatt hour, we used to get this kind of, when is clean energy going to be grid competitive? This is 1/3 of the price of any conventional alternative. Forget grid competitive, this is killing the grid. And it's the cheapest form of new electricity added to a grid anywhere in the world from any technology at any point in history. And it's clean energy. And this is still not understood by most mainstream commentators and many business people, and even people in the energy industry. They just don't believe it. Right? But that's what it is. Now, not only is that the world record, which means that the median is not quite as good as that, although it's going to approach that over time, but also it's variable. So the other thing people say is, even if they believe it, they say, but that is not the full cost, and so on. But what's happening is that the paradigm for a utility, if you see something as cheap as this, you buy it. If you need electricity, you see it at 2 cents, you buy it. And then you go, sun doesn't shine at night. Well, let's try and figure out, using the money you've saved by buying this cheap resource, you will then try and figure out how to meet the need at night or if the wind doesn't blow and so on. And so you obviously need a portfolio approach and technologies, which we'll talk about. But this is being driven into the electricity markets around the world, country after country, by the underlying economics now, not by policy decisions, but by the underlying economics. And the policymaker has to sort of create rules of the market and have to regulate utilities appropriately so that this cheap wind and solar can get into the market, but that's what we see. What's happening around the world? There you can see the Americas, Europe, Asia, New Zealand. renewable energy penetrating into the markets. The blue is dispatchable, right? So that is hydro and biomass and biogas. And then the yellow is this growing wedge of wind and solar. And a couple of things that are worth noticing. First of all, there are some blessed countries. I mean, there's a bunch that can do 2 cent wind and solar, those world records that we've seen, which will eventually be 1 cent. There's some other blessed countries here, or lucky countries, you could call them, which are the ones that have got a lot of hydro, or, well, the blue, which is mainly hydro. So Canada, Brazil, New Zealand, because it's much easier to balance the grid if you've got lots of hydro. Much easier to integrate that variability. So you can see it really stands out that some countries are very, very lucky from that perspective. The other thing, the other heuristic is that if you can see the yellow wedge, it's probably messing up your wholesale prices. Why? Because it's variable. Wind and solar appear when they want to, not necessarily when the market wants them to, and they have very low or even zero marginal costs. And that's why policymakers are having to rewrite the regulatory book, because it's great to have really cheap power, but if it means that your gas, your coal, maybe your nuclear say, well, I can't make money operating not 6,000 hours a year, but now I'm down to 4,000 and 2,000, I'm just going to shut up shop and go away, then there's a regulatory problem, because obviously somebody has to, you know, the politicians get kind of annoyed when the lights go out. So the regulators have to do something about that. And that's really the big battle that's going on at the moment. This is not some, you know, Birkenstock wearing, hippie. This is the Minister of State for Power, Coal. You've got to figure he knows his economics, new and renewable energy, and he says the cost of solar power is now cheaper. He means the cost of new solar power is now cheaper than the cost of new coal, right? What he's not saying is, oh, we can now shut all the coal in India and just have solar, right? He's not saying that. He's saying if you're building new stuff, you've got increasing demands for electricity, you'll add solar before you add coal. But interestingly, as the experience curve continues to drive down the cost of wind and solar, there will be a second break point. In India, it'll be about 2040. In other countries, it's about 2030, where actually you could say the cost of new solar power is now cheaper than old existing, or not even old, but just functioning coal plants in the market. And we're already seeing that in some parts of the US, where you'll just shut relatively new gas plants because it's so much cheaper to build new solar and new wind, particularly new wind in the US. So there's this second breakpoint where wind and solar approach not just the market for additional power, but all existing power. This is what's happening to capacity factors of coal. So everybody says, oh, why should we do anything? China's building a coal-fired power station every week. In fact, they were building 2, so that's good news. But the thing is that those power stations are being used less and less. Those investors building coal-fired power stations in China have a very good chance of losing money or making their mates lose money. So coal, you can see this is new build, right? But there's also retirements underneath the line, and net new build has come down by about 2/3 since 2006. Coal is being forced out of the system on the economics. Now, not everybody has heard about that. And some people may have heard, I don't know. So the nice thing about a statement like this, we've picked up 45,000 mining jobs in a very short period of time, is that you can fact check it. I'm sure you'd like to do. So there are only 50,000 coal mining jobs in the US. It's actually half an order of magnitude fewer than there are clean energy jobs, and they certainly have not increased. So these are final investment decisions for coal, but the interesting thing is also gas has not picked up the slack. The myth is that, well, emissions dropped in the US because coal was replaced by gas. Very simple story, right? Very easy to get your head around. It's not actually true. If you look at why emissions dropped from the power system in the US, the biggest contributor was energy efficiency or energy productivity. If the emissions had grown in line with the economy, right, they would have continued to go up, but they didn't, they've gone down. The biggest contributor is actually energy productivity. The second biggest contributor is actually coal to gas switching, but it's only just ahead of renewable energy by a smidgen. That's the full picture. So where are we? Well, 2017, I think we've just seen, there's just been an update now, 2018, 6% wind and solar globally. Right? It's now, today, about 8% in the first half of 2019. 8% of electricity everywhere in the world is already wind and solar. You wouldn't know that reading the business press, right? And this is for an industry, this has been done from pretty much a standing start about 15 years ago, starting from a huge cost disadvantage, and despite being irritating and variable and difficult to integrate into the grid, and against resistance from some very aggressive and wealthy incumbents. So I don't think it's controversial at all. There's the IEA says we'll get to a quarter, and the team that I trained says 40% wind and solar by 2040. So that's the first third is somewhere between a quarter and 40%. As I say, I don't think that's controversial. As I talk to audiences, they usually are sort of bludgeoned into agreeing, even if they started out not liking wind and solar. Now, it causes problems on the grid, right? Because it's variable, and you have to manage that. So the grid needs to balance, and what a lot of people sort of don't know is that it has to balance across all time frames, right? You can have minutes to seconds. So for instance, suddenly a generator trips out, and you have to keep the voltage and the frequency stable. Or you might have days to hours ahead. You might not forecast the fact that, I don't know, the sun burns off the fog a bit quicker and suddenly there's more power than you thought from the solar. Or the New Zealand women's soccer team makes it through to the final, and so suddenly everybody sits down in front of their television to watch it. Or not. And then months to weeks. So this one's really hard, right? Because people love solar, and Germany has got all this solar, of course, but it only has it in the summer, and in the winter it's not there. Or you've relied on a lot of wind. And the problem with that is that wind is absolutely fantastic, except that every so often there's 3 weeks where there's almost literally no wind across fairly large areas. And so your system has to be able to deal with all of that. And the good news is there's a bunch of technologies which are already at scale, and they're growing at double-digit rates to deal with this. And this is just the zero-carbon ones. Of course, there's gas peakers, and you could then have gas with CCS, but gas peakers with CCS will be very difficult to make economic. These are the zero-carbon ones. And you've got demand response, right? At that very kind of rapid changing end of things, software is going to dominate because bits are always cheaper than kit. Whatever anybody says, oh, I can do that with a battery, if you can do it with software, it's cheaper, I guarantee you. But you've got then batteries, electric vehicles, pumped storage, of course, in the New Zealand context, very important. Interconnectors, not so important. And then biomass and biogas, which you can use for balancing. There's some cool new technologies, economics much less well proven. Solar, CSP, where you can melt your salt and then it can carry you through the night and those sorts of things. But it's all up at the short end. I'm very interested in smart heating and cooling. Hot water is cheaper to store than electricity in a battery. And then there's longer term. You're almost certainly, for the longer term stuff, talking about molecules. Storage of molecules is going to be easier than storing in a battery. Think about it. If you've got that 3-week wind lull, how do you store 3 weeks of electricity? Storing electricity overnight, 2 days, fine. 3 weeks with a battery? Really? And seasonal, definitely not. You're not going to get towards the sort of end of summer, charge up your battery and say, there you go, I'm sorted for the winter. Single cycle per year, economics, not very good. So you're going to talk molecules. And digitisation. Unless it's digital, you cannot manage this system. Will not happen, because everything is moving all over the place and you're having to balance it. And also you're having to get value out of your assets. You're now an asset-intensive system instead of a fuel-intensive system. And to get the best value out of your assets, you'll need to manage them with digital. And luckily, digital is your friend, because the world that we are in and going even deeper into is one where chips and sensors will be ubiquitous. Not one thermostat per house, but per room, and moisture sensors and air quality and all sorts. Ubiquitous communications, everything's going to be connected. 5G or various mesh technologies and Bluetooth and Zigbee and goodness knows what. Processing and storage. I mean, you can process things in a device, or you can process it in the cloud. You'll have plenty of options. Machine learning used to be for big companies and big problems, and now you can have machine learning in your thermostat, and especially if it starts communicating with the cloud. So you can send it up to the cloud, learn something, and then be managed at the very low level. And that's becoming very cheap and affordable. And then blockchain and distributed ledgers, transactions pervade the system. So you won't have just 1 meter per block of flats or 1 meter per office building, as we still have in much of the world. You will have essentially the ability for a light bulb to buy some electricity from a solar panel, because the transaction capability will be ubiquitously integrated into the control of every device. And if you think, wow, that sounds kind of, crazed and futuristic, this is a picture of Pluto in 1994. 20 years later, this is a picture of Pluto. Digital stuff goes really, really fast. I think it's artificial colouring, so maybe we'll wait a few more years and we'll get real colour. So batteries, that was why digital wins up there, but batteries also very important on this system, and we're only at the very beginning of the battery journey. By the way, there's no shortage of lithium, there's no shortage of all the stuff that you read, over clicking in that sort of, the people who hate it sort of click world. No, batteries can grow like this. There are no obvious reasons why not. But here's an interesting thing. That's where the batteries will be. Some will be connected to the grid, the purple, I think 2 down from the top. But most of them will be in vehicles. Why? Because the battery in the vehicle offers this thing that's really valuable, which is clean mobility and the grid services. Whereas if you stick it stationary, it only provides the grid services. So clearly, that's more valuable than that. So we'll talk about the 1/3 of vehicles being electric. You're getting the idea that I kind of like experience curves. Prices on electric cars will continue to drop until they're within the reach of the average family. The Washington Post. Not a very controversial statement. The only problem with this statement is it was a little bit premature. 100 years or so premature. But it's now happening, because now we start to see the volumes of electric vehicles going up. Very rapid growth rates over 7-8 years now. Asia, 90%, Europe, 60%, Americas, 50%, buoyed by the Tesla 3 launch. But that growth has really started to move batteries down the experience curve. So we've seen those two for solar and wind. That's batteries, 18%. Battery costs have gone down by 80% plus since 2010. And they'll go down another 70% by 2030. Because the accumulative volume is not being driven by little batteries in your phone anymore, but by cars and larger installations. This is the economics of a car. Blue is the boring bit. Purple is the drivetrain. Blue is the battery. It's an electric car. And yellow is the internal combustion equivalent. What you can see is, because of the battery cost, 2016, it was absurdly more expensive. And the only way you'd buy one is if you got a rebate from the government, frankly. What happens is, sometime around 2024, maybe as early as 2022, for the equivalent vehicle, the sticker price, they become competitive. And the experience curve never sleeps, which means that once they cross over, it keeps going. So you walk into a showroom in 2022 or 2024 and you look at the two vehicles and they're the same cost. And you think, hang on a second, but that one accelerates better off the lights. I can smoke my neighbors, right? And that one has got a better entertainment system. And that one's smoother. And that one, I don't have to go to those fabulous Z energy petrol stations, which I enjoy going to, because did you know that the coffee's really good and the buns and everything? Except that apparently, and I mean, it does my head in, apparently there are some people that would rather lie in the morning than go to a petrol station. I mean, to a Z, I just don't get it, okay? I mean, but that's where we're going, right? It's very obvious which car at that point you'll buy. And by the way, it'll be cheaper to fuel because electricity is cheaper than petrol and diesel. And it'll be cheaper to maintain because it only has 17 moving parts in the drivetrain. So it's a no-brainer at that point. And we'll see, the batteries will be available, etc. We'll see the volumes really taking off. Now, where we are at the moment is actually, because the fuel cost is lower and the maintenance cost is lower, on a total cost of ownership basis, you've already had that crossover for many use cases. If you drive 40 miles a day every day, and that's all you worry about, you don't worry about the longer journeys or any of that other stuff, then you should be electric today without subsidies. But most people don't do spreadsheet calculations. They just look at the sticker price when they go into the showroom, and that'll be 2022, 2026. Model availability. In 2008, there was one model of electric car available. There was this crazy guy who put loads and loads of phone batteries into a car. 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, you get the idea. By 2022, there will be over 300 models of electric car. And up the left, you can see small vans, roundabouts, hatchbacks, sedans, sports cars, SUVs, and trucks. So right now, there are people like me can't find the right model of car. I've got 3 kids, and there's a granny and a nanny, and I live at the top of a hill for part of the year, and it's icy. I need a 7-seater, 4-wheel drive SUV, and I can't get one, but I will be able to. And so as soon as I can, I'm going electric. Done. Air quality. Who's got really good eyes? Can you see what these are? They're cars. They're Volkswagens in the desert. That's why the title is Dieselgate. And it's not just European cities that have air quality problems. You have them here as well. And that's a big driver. And that's a big driver for immediate decisions that mayors can make and councils can make. And there's this move to banning internal combustion vehicles. What are you going to replace them with? Personally, I'm waiting for one of these as well. I just think the sort of dual use, not only is it an electric car and I'm sort of saving the world, from climate change, but it's also sucking up all the particulates. So this is Bloomberg New Energy Finance. It's the team I trained. This is their forecast. In grey, you can see internal combustion vehicles. In blue, you can see the electric, pure electric, and in purple, battery. Blue is pure electric, battery electric, and in purple is the hybrids. And one thing that's very interesting, we are already at peak sales of internal combustion cars. Already. Right? That's not figured into the strategic plans of a lot of oil and gas companies or oil companies. So we're already at the peak. And then you can see the blue section takes out all of the growth. And the yellow line on the right, because that's the fleet, takes a few more years. So you get to about 55% of new cars being sold that will be electric by 2040, but the fleet will be 1/3. So that's the 2/3 of the 3/3 world. But it's not just cars, 2-wheelers. OPEC keeps meeting to talk about reducing the supply of oil because they want the price to be higher. Right? And they meet, and there's all these acres of newsprint and all this news coverage and websites and whatever. They talk about trying to get 1 million barrels a day out of the supply side. These two-wheelers have taken nearly a million, 800,000 barrels of oil per day out of the demand side already, with no media coverage. And of course, the other two-wheeler, which I know you're all expecting to see up there, these things arrived in Wellington on the exact same day as me. So it was auspicious. But it's not just two-wheelers, it's buses. I was very proud. I was on the board of Transport for London, and we had 120 electric buses. Biggest fleet in Europe. Europe as a whole had 2,000 something or other electric buses. Shenzhen, China, 16,500 electric buses, 400,000 electric buses in China. I thought it was a typo. I thought somebody put a couple of zeros too many on no. And why? Well, because it solves the core problem of cities, of air quality, and the economics work already. If you drive a bus 100 miles, 120 miles a day, then the reduced fuel costs, get rid of all that diesel, petrol, if there are petrol, but mainly diesel, and of course the maintenance costs being lower, it already makes sense. These things, trucks, small delivery vans, bigger delivery vans, and even the Tesla Semi or the Mercedes equivalent. The issue is not distance for commercial vehicles. It's not weight. It's not about heavy vehicles. It's about the distance they travel. As long as you're traveling a short distance, a battery is a better solution than anything else. And then we'll see these things also electric. We already see them a bit on the streets in London, because there's a huge amount of attention paid to drones, right? To Amazon drones, doing drone deliveries. And I joke and I say, well, the first time an Amazon drone flies over my house is the day I buy a shotgun. But I'm very happy for these things to drive past my house, right? I don't mind. Poodles past at 3 or 5 miles an hour. If they painted a big smiley face on it, I'd be even happier. But people don't mind. There is social acceptance of these small delivery robots. So those will be coming to streets, all over the world in the next few years. And then you get these kind of utility vehicles. The garbage truck's very interesting, not because it's going to save the world from climate change or anything like that, but because it's silent. You don't get that revving while it has to crush the cardboard boxes. And then these ones, they're going to go electric because the torque of electric is very, very interesting. And so you'll get a lot of electric that will be penetrating into those sorts of vehicles. I had a conversation a few days ago about somebody who was looking at doing electric logging trucks, because they figured that the trees are on the mountainside and you can sort of coast down with regenerative braking and then drive back up again. Never have to put fuel in it. Ships. Not every ship goes 5,000 miles, 10,000 miles, right? Or nautical miles. What you've got is a coastal freighter at the bottom. You've got ferries. We have a lot of ferries in New Zealand. So that's kind of interesting. And then you can do electric things on ships. Those are actually Flettner rotors. They act like sails. And big ships are actually, this blew my mind when I discovered it quite recently, big ships are already going hybrid. That's something called an azipod. So you put your big, dirty, bunker fuel burning engine on the ship, but it's only connected to the propellers by cables. Well, once you've gone hybrid, that gives you options for things like adding batteries and starting to use the flexibility of hybridization. And then aircraft. And if I'm not happy with Amazon doing a drone delivery over my house, you wait until it's a Goldman Sachs investment banker in one of these things. So they get a lot of attention as urban air transportation. And I think that the way to think about these things correctly is they're just really, really cheap helicopters. Economically, if you think about them as cheap helicopters, then you have a better idea of where they'll go into the market soonest. Does anybody know anywhere where they use a lot of helicopters? I've just come back from Queenstown. These things, slightly longer distance. The one at the top actually is already being bought by flying schools. And then you get this, Norway has said that all internal flights will be zero carbon by 2040. That chap there, it's a Zunum, and that would be great for buzzing over between Auckland and Wellington, or Christchurch and Wellington and so on, because the distance that will do with a just fully battery would enable it. And those are going to reach the market. They're going to actually sort of start popping up in places in about 2022. And in about 2024, they'll figure out that they don't actually know where to plug them in and charge them. And then that'll all get sorted out with investment, obviously. And then this thing is really interesting. This is a hybrid, and obviously of a much bigger aircraft. You're not going to go fully electric, but you will go hybrid. So it'll still burn jet fuel, maybe hydrogen. Why go hybrid? Because putting electric motors across the wing, electric motors have got fantastic torque, so you can take off from shorter runways. They're quieter, so you can take off earlier and later, earlier in the day, later in the evening. And what you can do with this thing is take off with all of the electric motors and then shut most of them down for cruise, which is very efficient, so you'll save fuel. Shorter runways, more operating hours, more efficient. Obviously not been built yet, but all of the major manufacturers are playing around with these sorts of designs. Hybrid. And of course, part of it, you can put a battery in, and you could maybe do short hops with renewable energy generated from New Zealand wind or whatever. But fundamentally, you'll be using jet fuel still. So isn't it all going to hydrogen? Shouldn't we be, this is all, everything's going electric in this world, maybe not the aeroplane, and maybe long distance ships and very long distance trucks, but most of it's going electric. Isn't this all wrong? Well, here you've got drawn to scale battery electric vehicle sales and fuel cell vehicles. And if I came back in 10 years' time and showed this chart, it would look the same. Right? And the reason is that the scale would have been crunched down by an order of magnitude or two, but it would still fundamentally look the same. Why won't hydrogen fuel cell vehicles work? Apart from the fact that they are much more complicated, those 17 moving parts against hundreds for the fuel cell, so that the vehicle will be more expensive. Maintenance will be more expensive because it's more complex. Also because every workshop has to get certified to work with hydrogen, which is actually quite expensive. But mainly because if you have electricity, you want to drive somewhere, stick it in a car and drive there, and you've got about 10% losses. Your alternative is turn it into hydrogen and have thermodynamic losses and efficiency losses, and then turn it back from hydrogen in the car into electricity and have more losses. Why would you do that? Hydrogen cars have a hold on the public imagination which mystifies me. If somebody knows why, I think it's to do with the 1970s and the shock that people got by the sudden thought that we won't have oil, and hydrogen was the savior technology, and it's very difficult to relinquish your hold on the savior technology of the day. But it's mystifying. So now I'll just finish off with a few thoughts on smart transportation. Okay. Actually, I'll finish off the trend, then I've got a few, get back to Paris and so on. So smart transportation, obviously, most visible is the appearance of these services, right? Uber and Lyft. Actually, there's still as many taxi drivers in the US, they just don't earn as much. The other trend that people love to talk about is driverless. There's old Barry being replaced by a card. And it looks funny, but Barry's a job. Barry's got a family that he's looking after and he's earning money for. So there's some very serious public policy questions as well. The money is flowing into, this is VC money going into mobility as a service, connected and autonomous vehicle. And you can see there, it's around averaging now the last sort of year and a half, about $7 billion US dollars per quarter, $30 billion a year. And the big companies are getting into it too. I'm sure many of you know this automation levels schematic, right? So you've got level 5, the car doesn't have a steering wheel. You just jump in it and you say, take me to grandma's. Level 4, you can do that, but only in certain places. So you drive along the motorway and you say, right, over to you, car, and I'm now going to check email, and that's fine. Or in certain towns or certain areas of town, maybe the CBD, you could do that. Level 3 is where the car takes, the car can drive, but you have to sort of stay alert, ready to pounce at a moment's notice in case the car does something stupid like suddenly swerve into oncoming traffic. And I think level 3 is essentially another word for corporate manslaughter, because humans are really bad at staying alert and then just waiting to take over at a second's notice and rescue their passengers from a potentially fatal situation. And we've seen that. So even the big companies, the Daimlers, the GMs, the Volkswagens, they all at level 3, and then all of them are saying that they'll get up there, level 5 by 2025. And I think they're wrong. I think this is a much, much harder technological problem than they think. There was a huge amount of hype. Everybody was terribly excited about this. And then, Elon Musk was going to drive a car across America, no driver by 2016, I think it was. It's now 2019, no sign of it happening. And this chap, John Krafcik, is the CEO of Waymo. Waymo is the most advanced in this race, according to all of the metrics of how often Waymo cars, require interventions and so on. And what he says, it'll be decades before autonomous cars are widespread on the roads. And even then, they won't be able to drive themselves in certain conditions. And my worry is that those conditions will be things like when the road is in New Zealand or when the road is in the UK, because it'll have rain and snow, and there's always something going on, right? This is not California, and neither is the UK. So this will be a lot longer to reach the market than people have been saying. And I think, if you bet on anything this side of 2030, I think will be very dubious. It could be even a lot longer. There's also problems with smart transportation that society needs to deal with, which is not technological problems. These are policy problems, behavioral problems. Parking is being restricted. Parking is a really stupid use of road space. You've got this big asset, sits there, does nothing, and it obstructs everybody. It's a road hazard for kids, and it means you can't have a bus lane or a cycle lane or something else you'd like to do with the space, sustainable drainage, roadside cafe. Parking is daft. So everybody says, okay, well, fine, we'll just ratchet down the amount of parking and we'll invest in public transport or these very clever autonomous things that will come along at some point. But meanwhile, the problem is, what happens when I say, fine, I'm not going to park, I'm just going to let my car drive round and round and round? People with chauffeurs get to do this now, but what happens when every rich person gets to do it? Or this, when you book to go to the boxing at Madison Square Garden, you look like boxing fans, or the concert. And when you buy your ticket, it says, do you want transportation? You go, oh yeah, one click, that's cool. I like that feature on a website. And it sends all of these cars to the same place at the same time. And it doesn't have an allocation algorithm, right? Because the cars are smart. So they all just turn up at the same time. And if you live near Madison Square Garden or you're trying to run a business, suddenly all these cars turn up within a few minutes. And then you can have this. Algorithms which are collectively dumb despite being individually smart. Because algorithms are not going to be different from humans, right? Humans are collectively smart, but they can also get in stupid traffic jams and create gridlock. And we're going to see that. And so municipalities also have to step into this. And whether it's dynamic road pricing, dynamic curb pricing, or algorithms to allocate to say, okay, you've all booked the same boxing match, but some of you are disabled, so you get to go and drop off nearby, and some of you look pretty fit, and so you're going to have to just walk 3 blocks. Who's going to police that? Travis Kalanick, founder and former CEO of Uber. We envision a world where there's no more traffic in Boston in 5 years. December 2015. That's 2019. How are we doing? Be very careful about promises that technology will save congestion or all of these problems. So I'll speed up now because I'm conscious of time, but I want to just touch on the last one of these, the economy being 1/3 more energy productive. That's actually not a controversial thing at all, because it's really the trend that we've already seen over the past few decades. The economy will grow, will more than double over the next, hopefully over the next 20 odd years. Final energy will grow I use final energy in all of these things, primary energy. If you ever see anybody using primary energy, what they're trying to do is make renewables look stupid. Primary energy, there is not a single question I've ever come across which can be answered using the metric of primary energy. If primary energy goes up, you don't know whether it's a shift to coal or whether it's economic growth or whether it's poor efficiency. It just doesn't tell you anything. Final energy starts to tell you about how your economy uses energy. So final energy will go up, final energy per GDP goes down by about a third. And that's a trend that we've seen. It's not controversial. There is, however, pretty cool innovation around energy efficiency. And you see these sorts of things. We've talked about digitization at the top right. You've got solar thermal integrated with solar photovoltaics. Then you've got things like Climeon, which can take waste heat at quite low temperatures and generate extra electricity from it. So you can recover heat usefully. You've got, in the middle there, you've got a fuel cell, micro CHP fuel cell. I've got one of those in my home. It's beautiful. Works 24/7, 1.5 kilowatts. Fantastic. Don't ask how much it cost. And then on the bottom left, you've got thermal batteries, phase change or molten salts, or there's just different ways of doing that. That's not what it looks like, by the way. That's a schematic for a thermal battery. In case anybody gets disappointed, they buy one and it doesn't look like a sort of like that. So there's an enormous amount of innovation around heat and efficiency, and I think this is a new frontier for innovation, and maybe that's something that some people in the energy department would be, or in the energy, the energy center might be thinking about. I like this. This was energy innovation, New Zealand style. We saw this over the weekend. You fill it with kerosene. It's really cool. It's new school. So there we are with the three-third world. And what the three-third world will do, it's far beyond what we expected 15 years ago when I started New Energy Finance. It will stop the growth in emissions. It's enough to cap emissions growth. The problem is that emissions accumulate in the atmosphere. So just not growing the emissions doesn't mean they don't grow in the atmosphere. And so it's absolutely not enough. It's absolutely not enough. What Paris says is that we have to eliminate emissions in the second half of the century. If you eliminate them by 2050, then we have a chance of being at 1.5 degrees. If you eliminate them by 2100, we'll see something around 2 degrees. And then there's nuances around capture and net negative and so on, but broadly speaking, that's how I see it. And we know from the IPCC report in October last year that if you really want 1.5 degrees, you have to get by 2030 to 45% emissions reductions. 2030. Now, what we've seen is that things change pretty fast. Go back to the beginning. We saw in 6 years this growth in clean energy to the point where it broke even. And we've seen this 6 years, you can do a lot. 6 years, the Norwegians went from almost no electric cars to half of their cars. In 6 years, LEDs went from almost nothing to 45%. In 6 years, the UK went from 40% coal to now 2% coal. The Germans are absolutely mystified. They don't know how we did it. We tell them it's a secret. We left the nuclear running. But 6 or 7 years, you can do stuff, but you've only got, between now and 2030, 2 of those kind of decision cycles. So the Mike Bennett's of the world, they get to do some stuff and see if it works, and then they get another go at it, and then we're in 2030. And we have to have a 45% reduction for 1.5 degrees, 20% reduction for 2 degrees. That's the challenge. And as I talk to audiences around the world, and they say, we've got 2050. 2050 is easy, right? 2050. No, forget 2050. Think 2030. Think about those 2 cycles that you've got. You get to launch a business, grow it. If it doesn't work, you've got one more chance. Think of it like that. 2030, you better start tomorrow. If there are any investors in the audience, if you think about what do you need to own in 2030 that has 20 to 45% lower emissions, figure out what you want to own, and then start work Monday morning. right? Because don't leave it to 2029 when everybody else is already running for the exits. You need to be starting Monday morning. So I use this concept of 2030 and business cycles to try to get some sense of urgency into audiences, not like this one, who may not yet be feeling it. And if you want to get to 20% and 45% reductions in emissions and on to zero emissions, you won't do it just from what we've covered in the third world. Electricity, EVs, bit of energy efficiency. We've got to accelerate all of that. You'd want to go faster than the third world. You know, if you can get to the 40%, 40%, 40%, that would be great. But you've got to get into these difficult things. You've got to get into shipping and freight and air travel and manufacturing and chemicals and agriculture and heat. And if you look at it in the New Zealand context, some of these are existentially important to do and to start now, to lead, first to do it yourselves and also to lead the world. Air travel. What does New Zealand's economy look like in a world where air travel has to go zero carbon? Maybe it can be done with hydrogen, but what happens if it's really expensive? What does that do to New Zealand's economy? That might be something you want to work on sooner rather than later. Agriculture, similarly, existential. Those are your two big big sectors, tourism and agriculture. And finally, as you do all of that, it's got to be a just transition. And by that, I mean you've got to do all this stuff. Most of it can be done without pushing up costs because the economic drivers are so powerful, but some of it will drive up costs. And it mustn't drive up costs for the most vulnerable in our society. And you've got to do this at the same time. There's still 900 million people without electricity. It's the lowest number in the history of the planet of people without electricity. Well, since we had 900 million, which is many hundreds of years ago, in fact. Possibly, I don't want to guess there. But we've had many billions without electricity, and it's now come down all the way to 900 million, which is great, but they've all got to have access to modern energy services. And there's 2.5 billion that still cook at great cost to their health and their family health using wood and charcoal and even dung. And we've got to sort that out at the same time as dealing with all of the above. And I know we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So we've got 10 minutes for questions. So, Julian, do you want to take that on? And I'll look after this. So it's all ready to go.
First? Hi, thanks for that. You talked about the cost of wind and solar. What are the investment bases depreciated over? Is that a 20-year depreciation rate applied to these rates? Or?
So what that is a levelized cost, which looks at the lifetime of the asset. So that would be generally 20 years for wind, 25 years for solar. And then but it also covers the cost of capital. So that's what an investor would need. If you got one price for that whole period, what would that price need to be in order not just to pay for the capital cost and the maintenance and so on, but also to cover the cost of equity and the cost of debt at the sort of debt equity ratios that we know you're able to achieve.
Wow.
And by the way, you know, what you can then do is you can repower projects and so on, and it doesn't get into all of that stuff. It just says, right, 25 years, we dismantle, we're done.
I have a question about the electricity sector in New Zealand. You're aware that we've got multiple companies. New Zealand isn't that big, and you talk about the challenge going forward with renewables, about trying to balance things. It makes it very difficult when some electrical companies have larger renewable assets and others don't. Do you think there'd be any advantage in New Zealand putting all of the electricity companies back into what they used to be in the old days to make it easier for us to meet our targets?
I don't know enough, but I doubt it. Because one of the... First, you've got a transmission grid, and then when you say you've got many companies, those would be distribution companies. And what you will need to do is to balance more at the distribution company level. So the old model was you had lots of big generators connected to the transmission grid, and then it was kind of one-way traffic out to the edge. And now, of course, you've got stuff hanging on the edge, whether it's roofs, personal, individual homes, but it might be also box retailers and so on. And then you've also got a lot of your wind and bigger solar farms connected to the distribution grids. What you need to do then is, first of all, run each grid as a market, balancing as much as possible locally so it doesn't go off to the transmission grid and back, but then buying and balancing via the transmission grid. And the good news is that, as I said, with digitisation, you can do that just better and better and better. So if you do have one grid that's got lots of pumped hydro, let's say, and another one that's got wind, you've got a good transmission grid and you've got great engineers. And so you really should be able to solve that without having to sort of do anything very heavy-handed and institutionally blunt, like renationalising it all.
Hi, my name is Ajay. Thank you so much for the presentation. So I just have a question about what happens. So with the electric vehicles, with the high uptake of electric vehicles, at a point in time where the battery is going to deplete. So what do you think the market is going to be for the depleted battery vehicles? So what could be done for the rest of it?
Well, that's a really interesting question, thank you, about what do you do with depleted batteries and how fast do they degrade and so on. And I started out being very skeptical about vehicle to grid, because what happens is you saw that the batteries were really, really expensive. You'd have, that chart that I showed with the green battery bit, that was probably a Nissan Leaf, and it was sort of $45,000 of battery or something, and it only had 500 cycles. And so you just do the division and you think, wow, that's, well, somebody will do the maths now, but I think it's like $90 per cycle. Very, very expensive. And but you can use it to support the grid and you can earn, maybe $1 a night. But you're doing $90 or $40 or $10, as it comes down, of damage. And so I thought, this is all rubbish. And then you say, okay, well, maybe what you do is when the battery is done and starts not performing, there'll be a second life market, because that's the other business model that people postulate. And they say, well, you're going to connect it to the grid. And I thought, you know what? It just doesn't sound very plausible. When server farms came along, we wanted to have servers serving all of this content on the internet, nobody went round and bought all the used PCs to say, yeah, I'm in the server farm business. I've got some old, 386s and a bunch of 486s, and I got really clever. No, what we did was we built tailor-made PCs and we'll do the same. If we want to hang on things onto the grid, there'll be tailor-made batteries for the grid. So that was kind of Liebreich 1.0 thinking about those two models is, you'll keep the batteries and you'll either replace the battery halfway through the life of the car, or probably you'll sell the car. So in most countries, what would happen is the car from Germany would get sold to Poland, and from Poland it would go off to Moldova or whatever. And of course, you've got a slight problem that your cars will be coming from Japan. But that was what I thought. Now, what we're seeing though is battery technology in terms of breakthroughs that make energy density so so high that you can use them in aircraft and so on. That's not where innovation is. We'll kind of get solid state batteries in 5 or 10 years and whatever. But where we are going with batteries is that their lifetime is becoming longer and longer. The number of cycles. So although you may only have 1,000 cycles for a vehicle battery, there's 10,000 cycles for essentially the equivalent battery in the home. So your Powerwall or Sonnen, the equivalent, they say 10,000 cycles. And then you start thinking, well, hang on a second, supposing technology keeps going, and there's no reason why it shouldn't, in fact, there's every reason to believe it will, supposing we get to 10,000 cycles of vehicle battery for 200-mile battery, and you get 10,000 cycles, that's a 2 million-mile battery. That battery is going to way outlast what the car can do. So then you start saying, and there's another data point, which is the big amount of data, the largest data set that we've got is Tesla's, where you've got 90% battery life after 250,000 kilometers. So we're not yet at a 2 million mile battery, but it's not implausible to think within a few years that new batteries in cars can expect to be 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 kilometers, or even into the millions. And then you start asking, well, why wouldn't you do vehicle to grid? And why wouldn't you, at the end of that car's life, when the doors fall off and I was going to say the exhaust pipe falls off, but of course there isn't one, but when that car becomes, unusable for whatever, one thing is maybe we just start make cars that last longer because they didn't need to up till now because the engine didn't last that long, So I don't know the answer to what happens, but I know it's going to get really, really economically interesting, and none of it is in these models. The idea of having vehicle to grid becoming essentially free after a few 100,000 kilometers, really interesting. And as I say, I don't think anybody is putting that into any of these models.
Michael, thank you for your presentation. As we try and move towards a zero carbon world, so much of it is about behaviours and personal choices. And can you perhaps share with us what you're doing to make your difference become carbon neutral as a consumer and as a family?
So on this, my guide, my guru on this is Rag and Bone Man, who says, "I'm only human," if you know the song. Because, I really try, but unfortunately, I have a lifestyle where I travel around the world and I have to fly. So what I've done is, in my home in London, I have two places. I've got a home and a holiday home in Switzerland. In London, I've done a very deep carbon retrofit, and I've implemented a dozen innovative technologies, phase change materials, that fuel cell, very efficient appliances, insulation, passive ventilation in the chimneys and so on. And so I was able to reduce the carbon footprint of that home by 60 or 70%. And it's an 1860s home. So I could not get it to zero, but I did what I could. And then also looked at innovative ways to meet that. So I've also got solar on the roof. I've got a heat pump. I kind of got one of everything. And I think that the big impact of that is actually, it was written up in the FT. If you want more information on it, I can point you at it. But it was also, I think the big value for me at least was the learning, right? Because I can go around, I know I've got the scar tissue associated with that. So I can tell policymakers a lot, I can be much more credible talking to policymakers about what to do. I don't have a car in London. That's terribly virtuous. And our utilities are green gas, green this, green that. Okay, cool. Switzerland, very interesting. The Swiss buildings are so well insulated, my chalet, that the snow melts on the ground before it melts on the roof. Right? So very good insulation, amazing. And I've got, the heating is pellets, wood pellets, and solar thermal, and the electricity is all green. Unfortunately, it's at the top of a hill, and it gets snow, and I have 3 kids and a granny and a nanny often, so I need a 7-seat SUV, and I've got a petrol, 4.4 litre petrol Volvo XC90, and my next car will be electric, because I believe that stuff about the models. And so my big, what do I do that's evil? Then in dietary terms, I'm way the hell off red meat, I apologize to a nation that has built its wealth on sheep and cows, but I am almost off beef, not entirely. I do like a little bit of lamb, especially here where it's fantastic. But I've also been doing a lot more sort of experimentation. In fact, I was in California and I tried the Impossible Burger, which my kids declared tastier than a beef burger, and they weren't wrong. So I think Beyond Meat, all of that stuff is actually, it's a thing. And I think, by the way, it's a thing that's going to impact on New Zealand's economy. So my evil things are basically my car, which is going, and flights. Vastly my flight footprint, and most of it is associated with, doing this. And I hope, and it'll be up to you, I hope that there'll be an offset in the sense that some of you will go out and say, well, we can, accelerate, or we can lean into the transitions that are being discussed here in New Zealand, and then I can feel not sort of horribly bad about having flown down here 28 hours from London.
Do you offset your flights?
I don't offset my flights, and I think long and hard about it. It's not first of all, I don't think there's a wrong answer on these. For anybody who's thinking about it, that's good. That's the first thing to say. I don't offset my flights because I can't work out why I should, given that, if you look at that investment trend, the green bars right at the beginning, There's been about, it must be now nearly $3 trillion invested in clean energy. And I guarantee that half of it was done by BNEF clients. And I think my impact, if you take, I'm a thermodynamics guy, right? So what is the boundary of the system of Michiel Liebreich that you're trying to offset? Why only his flights? Why not his whole life? And if you take his whole life, then I think you'll be okay with the impact that I've had on accelerating investments in wind and in solar and energy efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. So the selection of my flights, saying, well, not only do you have to be a sort of good person overall, but you've got to break it down. Every single thing you do has to be good. I just can't follow the logic of that. I know other people can, but they've not been able to persuade me. So I'm trying to be a good person. And by the way, I plant trees, and one thing I've said is before I shuffle this mortal coil, I'd like to plant 1 million trees. So that will probably deal with all of that, as long as I live long enough to actually do it, which I hope to.
Michael, we have time for one more question.
Can I just ask for one? So, the gender mix here is fabulous, but guys tend to ask questions more than women. So can we try and get balance? I don't know if we... I don't know who was next up, but I like to do that just to send a message about inclusion as well. Sorry, sir. For the greater good. I'm sure. Come and ask me your question afterwards. Come on, there must be some. Come on, there must be a. Come on, if not, we'll go back to the gentleman. But there must be a woman here that wants to ask something. The reason I do that, by the way, is I wrote a piece a few years ago which really resonated with a lot of people. And I said that, we're doing these extraordinary transitions. At the time, people had just woken up in the mainstream that, yes, there is an energy transition, there's a transport transition. And the point I made was that the leadership of the energy and transportation sectors, which was essentially guys who look like me, there is no way at the end of those transitions, if we want to do those transitions efficiently and effectively and with justice, there's no way the leadership will look the same afterwards as it did before. And it resonated. A lot of people were like, hey, thanks for saying that. So I now take the opportunity to make that point in public forums whenever I get a voice. Right, you got the microphone. That was me just winning, just trying to get you a bit of time there. Good, thank you.
There's a lot of, I guess, the energy forecasting modeling that you've done is looking at the mismatch in demand between the production of solar and heating energy, but increasingly with climate change and the way temperatures are, a lot more heating is related to cooling, which does match very well with solar. And I'm just wondering if any of the modeling you've done takes that change in demand into account as well.
Okay, so that's a great point that, cooling, when people say, oh, there's this sort of more and more cooling, you sort of say, well, that can't be that big of a problem because mainly cooling happens in places where it's sunny. And, yes, it could be hazy, so it's like, okay, just build more solar. It's not that big of a deal because it's so cheap. But cooling, heating is a different thing because heating happens when there isn't sun and it's much more complex. The changes in that as a result of climate change are, for the next few decades, with all respect to the gravity of the climate challenge, which I don't discount, they all have a second order relative to the fact that the middle classes in the developing world all want air conditioning. They want air conditioning today. They'll want it more as climate change progresses, but that's an additional effect. That second order relative to the first order effect, which is they want air conditioning now. But you raise a really interesting point about, there's two interesting things I'd like to comment on if I have time. One is, when I say, well, if it's hazy, just build more solar, we haven't talked about curtailment. And a lot of people say, oh, this stuff, because it's variable, not only is it, the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine at night, and so that's a huge problem. But then they say, okay, but there's this other problem, which is sometimes there's too much of it, and we must use it, because our parents told us never to leave anything on the plate. So if there is extra wind, we must build an electrolyzer, and we must make hydrogen. Well, electrolyzers are capital intensive. You need compressors, you need to store the thing, you need to invest a load of stuff. The idea that you would then use it only when there's a big puff of wind or on a really, really sunny day, I think is fanciful. So we're going to get curtailment. Oh, terrible curtailment. But actually think about this. Supposing you've got 2-cent wind or 2-cent solar, and supposing you had a vast level of curtailment, more than any system has ever experienced so far, 33%, right? 1/3 curtailment. That means 1/3 of the output is wasted. All that does is turn that 2-cent wind, 2-cent solar into 3-cent wind or 3-cent solar. It's still half the price of anything else. So just, obviously try and deal with curtailment, try and store it, do something, sell it to a neighbor, but it's not the end of the world. And the final thing about energy modeling, all these models that go out to 2050 and beyond and so on, they all become nonsensical, including the ones that say, oh, it's going to be this percent of GDP and the RCP 8.5, how much carbon is going, because things get so unpredictable. You cannot predict that there will be continuing emissions from power stations that will be underwater. And we have no idea, frankly, how our economy works. We know that because what happened in 2008. And so all these people who can say, well, that there's going to be 5.6% of GDP absorbed by this, that, or the other. No, we just deal with this issue, then we don't have power stations underwater, and we don't have economic losses, and we don't have justice issues. So we just deal with it, I think.
Okay, so we'll just draw it to a close. Now, we have a tradition here. Okay, so we'll get somebody from Z Energy to draw a card here.
Stephen Trotton? Nova Energy.